She manipulated me into a state of total submission for 3 years, but I finally snapped out of it the moment she suggested we get married. When she showed up at my office in downtown Seattle, flaunting a diamond ring, I didn't hesitate to have security escort her out of the building. I had already uncovered every one of her schemes and secrets. Yet even as her life spiraled into ruin, she felt no remorse, only resentment that I had cut her off financially. From the very start, she had looked at me as nothing more than a pawn and a complete idiot. While I was at the bank making a deposit, I happened to scroll past an interesting thread on a QA site. The title caught my eye, asking, "What is the most insane thing you have ever kept secret from your husband?" One comment stood out, saying, "I am currently pregnant with my first love's baby, and we have already officially tied the knot." The funny thing is, my boyfriend is still cluelessly dumping money into our joint savings account. He is incredibly naive, thinking that once he saves up enough for the house and the wedding, he can give me the big ceremony of his dreams. There's already $67,000 in the account, and as soon as he hits $88,000, I'm going to withdraw every last cent and disappear. I was just about to hit the like button when my thumb slipped, and I happened to glance at my own bank balance. It was the exact same amount, down to the penny, $67,000. I felt a chill run down my spine as the thought hit me. There was no way my girlfriend was already married and pregnant. The moment the realization set in, my first instinct was to deny it completely. Ava and I had been together for almost 3 years, and things had always seemed rock solid between us. Our parents had even had a formal dinner together just a few weeks ago to discuss our future. There was no way she could be that cold-hearted scammer from the post. I walked through the front door of our place in Seattle with my head spinning, looking for the right moment to sit Ava down and talk. Before I could even hang up my jacket, Ava was already standing right in front of me. She looked up with a bright smile and said, "Hey babe, I just transferred $100 into our joint savings. So how much are you putting in this month? Since you're making way more than me, I figured you would probably want to contribute a bit extra, right?" Ava waved her phone in front of my face, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. My hand instinctively moved toward my bag, where I could feel the thick envelope tucked inside. It was the end of the month, and I had just received a $3,000 performance bonus in cash. My boss had handed it to me personally because our team had just closed a massive deal for the firm. My plan had been to deposit the cash immediately, which would have brought our total savings to exactly $70,000. But then I had to go and see that post on my way to the bank. All the excitement I felt about my bonus vanished the second I finished reading that comment. I found it hard to believe that such a perfect coincidence could exist, and I began to question whether I could ever trust anyone again. Once the seed of suspicion was planted in my mind, it began to spread like wildfire, and I could not push the thoughts away. I took a long breath and forced myself to look as miserable as possible. I looked at Ava and said, "Work was rough this month, so the company decided to skip the bonuses for our department. Plus, my mom has been feeling under the weather lately, so I had to wire her $600 for her medical bills." As I spoke, I kept my eyes locked on Ava to see how she would react. The smile slowly drained from her face, and her eyes narrowed as she began to scrutinize me from head to toe. She pouted and looked quite annoyed as she said, "You usually put away at least $2,000 or $3,000 a month. Are you seriously telling me you are not going to save anything this time? If you stop saving, how are we ever going to have enough for the wedding fund? How are we supposed to buy a house and get married? Or do you just not want to marry me anymore?" The moment she mentioned marriage, I felt like I was going to explode with rage. I had a sudden urge to drag her straight to the county clerk's office right then and there to check her public records. I gave her a cold stare before turning around and walking toward the bedroom. I could not help but snap back. "Your mother's the one demanding such an insane amount of money for this wedding. So why didn't you stand up for me then? If I cannot produce $88,000, are you just going to call the whole thing off? If you had never met me, would you be making these kinds of financial demands on some other guy? Ava, stop trying to guilt trip me, because I already told you that I simply do not have the money this month. I must have hit a nerve because her face went pale for a second, but she quickly composed herself and followed me into the room. She said, "James, you need to understand that I am only trying to help you. Every penny I have saved over the last 2 years has gone into our joint account, just so we could afford this wedding sooner. Everyone else saves up for their own wedding, so I don't understand why you are acting like this." However, the more she talked, the less convincing her voice became. We both knew that the tiny amount she had contributed was nothing compared to the total we supposedly needed. This whole idea of us working together and her acting like the perfect, supportive girlfriend now felt like nothing more than a long-term psychological game. I let out a dry laugh and took a seat at my desk. I looked at her calmly and said, "I have a strange feeling that even if I didn't give you a single dime, you would still find a way to get married to someone else." I knew that if I confronted her directly, she would just deny everything and call me crazy or paranoid for even suggesting such a thing. I realized I needed a better plan to make her reveal her true colors on her own. When she saw that I wasn't budging, Ava started to panic and grab my arm. She said, "Look, your base salary alone is over $2,000 a month. Even if you sent your mom $600 after our living expenses, you should still have plenty left over. You should be able to put all of that extra money straight into our savings." Ava had never been this meticulous about tracking my income in the past. Her sudden interest in my finances felt like a slap in the face that finally woke me up to the truth. I realized that I had been paying for almost every single one of our living expenses for years. Aside from the symbolic $100 she put into the joint account, she never seemed to spend any of her own money on us. I watched her lips moving as she kept talking, and then I suddenly interrupted her by saying, "Ava, let's just go get married right now." The room went dead silent, and I could actually hear the sound of her swallowing hard as she froze in place. All of her excuses and arguments seemed to get stuck in her throat, and she just stared at me blankly. I rubbed my temples and forced a fake smile on my face. "We have enough money saved up, and we aren't getting any younger. So let's just go to the courthouse and make it official. You're always telling me how much you want to be my wife. So let's go do it." But Ava didn't look happy or excited at all, which was exactly what I expected. Instead, I saw a look of pure, desperate panic flashing behind her eyes. After a long and awkward silence, she finally found her voice and leaned against me. "Babe, we agreed that we would wait until we had $88,000 saved up before we bought the house and had the ceremony. Why the sudden rush to get married today? Because doing it like this would just ruin everything we have planned." She was staring at me with such obvious fear that it was clear she was terrified I might actually be serious. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a ring I had bought a long time ago, and slowly slid it onto her finger. I looked her in the eye and said firmly, "I'm just worried that if I don't marry you right now, you might end up with someone else." I said it like a joke, but I could tell the words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Her knees seemed to buckle, and she sank onto the floor in a heap. She stammered, "Babe, marriage is a huge deal, and we really need to take our time to talk this through. Besides, your mother isn't doing well, and she probably wouldn't even have the energy to deal with a wedding right now." Ava couldn't even look me in the eye while she spoke, and she kept glancing around the room nervously. I patted her on the shoulder and acted like everything was perfectly normal. "Actually, my mother's health is the reason I want to do this now, because seeing us married would make her so happy and help her recover. You wouldn't want to deny my sick mother that kind of joy, would you?" My words completely shut down her weak excuses and left her with nothing to say. She bit her lip so hard it turned white, and she couldn't find a single word to argue back. She scrambled up from the floor and stammered about needing to call her parents to tell them the news. I acted oblivious and let her take her phone into the other room. Within 2 minutes, I could hear her hushed voice coming through the wall of the study. The walls in this place are thick, so I grabbed a glass and pressed it against the wall to listen. The muffled noises immediately became much clearer as I leaned in. I heard her voice go up a pitch as she said, "Sweetie, as soon as you get back to the States, we can be together every day. Please take care of yourself while you are away, because I'm so worried about you." Hearing those words was the final proof I needed, that my suspicions were absolutely correct. That tiny seed of doubt in my mind suddenly exploded into a giant, twisted tree of betrayal. I felt like my heart was being ripped apart as the reality of the situation set in. In the next room, Ava continued in her sweet, fake voice, "Sweetie, we can start planning for the new house the second you get home. Don't worry about the money, because I've actually saved up quite a bit myself. I've got plenty of cash ready for us." Listening to her say that made my stomach turn with bitter irony. The idea of Ava having her own money was the biggest joke I had ever heard. Of the $67,000 in that account, $66,000 of it came from my own hard work. The next morning, I woke her up early and told her we were heading straight to the courthouse to get married. Ava completely lost it and curled up in the blankets, refusing to even move from the bed. She started crying and said, "Babe, this is just too fast, and I think I'm having a panic attack about the commitment. Can we please just slow down and wait a little longer before we do this?" To be honest, I had no actual intention of marrying her that morning. But watching her squirm and make excuses only proved that every single one of my suspicions was true. I threw her hand off me and shoved her back down onto the mattress. "Fine, stay here and rot in your own fear then. I have some business to take care of, and when you're finally ready to be honest, we could go to the courthouse." Ava nodded frantically, and I could see the massive wave of relief wash over her face. She reached out to grab my hand and said in a fake, caring voice, "Drive safe, honey. I love you so much." I stopped at the front door as a wave of nausea hit me. She had told me she loved me thousands of times over the last 3 years. It wasn't until that very moment that I realized how disgusting those words could sound. I turned around and looked at her with a smirk, asking, "You love me? That's funny, Ava, because if you actually loved me, you would be the one dragging me to the courthouse right now." I acted like my heart was completely shattered and stumbled out of the room. Ava didn't have a single word left to say to that. She just turned her back to me, her entire demeanor shifting into something cold and distant. She said in a freezing tone, "Are you trying to threaten me, James?" I didn't bother answering, because I knew that silence was the most powerful weapon I had. I drove straight to the real estate office in Seattle that I had visited a dozen times before. While I was driving, I pulled out my phone and transferred every cent of my $66,000 out of her joint account. That money represented every single dollar I had managed to save since the day I graduated college. Since Ava clearly had no intention of being my wife, there was no reason for me to keep a wedding fund for her. Now that the wedding was off, I realized I could finally afford to buy that house on my own. Luckily for me, the property I had been eyeing had just dropped in price. I only needed $60,000 for the down payment to lock in the contract right away. I didn't hesitate for a second before signing the purchase agreement. My phone screen lit up just as I was signing the final set of papers. It was a call from Ava, probably finally noticing the empty account. I ignored the call and went back to reviewing every single clause of the contract. It was obvious she had seen the balance and was desperate to demand an explanation. When I didn't answer, she started bombarding me with iMessages, asking where all the money went. That was our joint savings, so why would you move it without even talking to me first? You need to put that money back right now, or I'm never going to forgive you for this. I didn't even bother to type a response. Instead, I checked her activity on Facebook and saw her location tags moving all over the city. It was clear she was frantically driving around Seattle, trying to hunt me down. She could spend the rest of her life guessing, but she would never imagine I was busy buying a house. Once the paperwork was finalized, I took a slow, relaxing drive back to the apartment. Ava wasn't there when I arrived, as she was likely still out there searching for me. I sat on a sofa by myself and watched my phone light up repeatedly with her missed calls. I sat there in silence as the last 3 years of our relationship flashed before my eyes. I remembered our first date, the moment we moved in together, and all the plans we had made. I had truly believed that we were in love and that we were going to spend the rest of our lives together. But that single comment on the internet had acted like a brutal wake-up call, revealing the monster behind her mask. A notification sound from the computer in the study snapped me back to the present. I reached up to wipe my face and realized that I was actually crying. I walked into the study and saw that Ava had been so rushed that she forgot to log out of her iMessage on the desktop. There were two pinned conversations at the top of her list, one with me and one with her first love, Ethan. Even while she was frantically searching for me, Ava had still found the time to keep messaging Ethan. Ethan had sent her a text saying, "Honey, please be careful out there. Remember that you're carrying our baby, so don't push yourself." She had replied, "Don't worry, babe. I'm being careful. I miss you and I love you so much." The rage that I had been trying to keep under control finally exploded inside of me. Ava was not only married to her first love, but she was also carrying his child. And here I was, the supposed boyfriend who didn't even know she had a husband or a baby on the way. A few minutes later, Ethan sent another message saying, "Your bump is going to start showing in a couple of months, so when are you going to finally tell that guy the truth? Because it feels wrong for my wife to be living with another man." Reading that message felt like someone was squeezing the life out of my heart. I had initially assumed he was just some guy she was seeing on the side, and I even thought about calling him to expose her. But now I realized that both of them were exactly the same kind of trash. They deserved each other, as neither of them had a single shred of decency or honesty. Then a new message popped up from Ava's mother saying, "Ava, can't you even handle one man? Because if so, then everything I taught you is a waste." The woman I thought was my sweet future mother-in-law was actually the one coaching Ava on how to scam me. I felt a wave of nausea and had to grip the edge of the desk just to keep from falling over. I realized that my entire life for the last 3 years had been nothing but a carefully orchestrated fraud. It was sickening that an entire family could be this cold-blooded just to steal a few $1,000s from me. I made a note of Ethan's contact info, closed the iMessage window, and walked out of the room as quietly as possible. About 30 minutes later, Ava burst through the front door, screaming about how I was a bastard for touching her money and that I would be getting on my knees to beg for her forgiveness. I was leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping water when I calmly asked, "Oh, so you want me to get on my knees?" Ava froze mid-step and just stared at me. She marched over and grabbed me by the shirt, screaming, "James, where the hell did you put our money?" I pulled my arm away and sat down on the sofa, telling her in a flat voice that she needed to watch her tone and that the money belonged to me. "You've only contributed about $1,000 in 2 years, so I don't know why you think any of that money belongs to you." Ava looked like she was about to explode with rage, her knuckles turning white as she clenched her fists. She tried to control her anger and hissed, "We are getting married, James, which means that money is our joint property. So how could you just take it? And what did you even do with it?" I leaned back and casually said, "I bought a house." Ava's eyes widened in shock as she shrieked, "You did what with our money?" I didn't feel like repeating myself, so I just took out my phone and started playing a game. Ava lost her mind and slapped the phone right out of my hand. The phone hit the floor with a loud crack, and the screen shattered instantly. She screamed at the top of her lungs, asking if she even mattered to me and why she wasn't included in my plans. It was just as I expected. She was trying to turn the whole thing around and make me out to be the villain. I was so fed up that I didn't even think before I reached out and slapped her across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the room, and I have to admit, it felt incredibly satisfying. I looked at her with pure disgust and told her to shut up and remember who she was talking to. Ava went completely silent and just stood there in shock, like she couldn't believe what had just happened. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered that I had betrayed her and that I would live to regret hitting her. I walked over to pick up my broken phone and sat back down on the couch like nothing had happened. I told her in a businesslike tone that the phone had cost me $1,000 and that she was going to pay for the replacement or I would take her court for property damage. Ava was trembling with rage and looked like she wanted to start another screaming match, but instead she grabbed a vase and smashed it against the security camera in the corner. "You are the most selfish and petty man I've ever met, and there is no way I'd ever marry someone as manipulative as you." It was amazing how quickly the woman I had once adored could turn around and start treating me like dirt. I ignored her insults and pulled out the house contract, showing it to her with a cold smile. You know, I might actually consider putting your name on the deed because I have never really cared about money as much as I care about you. I hid my disgust and softened my voice, acting like I had only been acting out because I was hurt. Ava's rage disappeared instantly, and she looked at me with sudden interest. She dropped to her knees in front of me and asked if I had changed my mind, her mind clearly racing with greed. Maybe we can cancel this one and go pick out a house that we both love together? I sat back and watched her for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. No, the house is fine as it is, and as long as we get married, half of it will be yours. I could see the literal sparkle of greed in her eyes, even though she was trying to act cool. I pretended to hesitate before telling her that my father had already agreed to give us $88,000 for the wedding. So the house was taken care of, and she just needed to decide if she wanted to be my wife. She looked a bit conflicted for a second and didn't give me an answer right away. I didn't give her a chance to respond. I just went into my room and locked the door behind me. It wasn't long before I heard her on the phone in the next room, but I didn't even bother listening because I already knew what was happening. It was going to go one of two ways. Either she would leave and give up the money, or she would try to scam me even harder. Either way, I was going to make sure that her and her family's lives were turned into a total nightmare. There was a soft knock on my door about 30 minutes later. Ava's voice was sweet as honey as she told me through the door that she was ready to get married and that next month would be the perfect time for the ceremony. It was obvious she was planning to get a quick divorce from Ethan so she could marry me for the money. I told her that sounded fine, but she still owed me $1,000 for the phone she broke. She didn't hesitate for a second before saying she would transfer the money immediately. I watched the $1,000 transfer hit my account, and I couldn't help but laugh to myself. Oh, and I just talked to my dad, and he said it's against our family tradition for us to live together before the wedding. So you're going to need to move out. We have been sharing the rent on this 2-bedroom apartment for 2 years, and it was quite expensive. Ava went quiet for a second before suggesting that I should be the one to move out since her job was closer. What a joke. I had paid for every single month of rent for the last half year, including the upcoming 3 months, and she actually had the nerve to ask me to leave. I told her that wasn't going to happen unless she paid me back for her half of the rent for the last 6 months. Ava knew she didn't have a leg to stand on, so she packed her bags and was gone by the next morning. I didn't hear much from her over the next couple of days, aside from one call where she claimed she was going out of town on business. I knew exactly what that meant. She was going to finalize her divorce from Ethan, but I just played along and told her to have a great trip. Before I hung up, I made sure to mention that my dad was ready to send the wedding money as soon as she got back. Her voice instantly became sweet, and she told me she couldn't wait to come home and visit my parents with me. I didn't say another word and just hung up on her. On the night she left, I received a message request on Instagram from a guy named Ethan. I hadn't even started looking for him yet, and here he was reaching out to me. As soon as I accepted, he started firing off messages telling me that he and Ava were legally married and that I would be sued for interfering with their marriage. I actually laughed out loud at his threat and sent back a reply asking if that meant Ava was trying to scam me for wedding money or if I should just call the cops. Ethan was clearly fuming and replied instantly, accusing me of being the one who seduced his wife and telling me that I better stay away if I didn't want to get hurt. I hadn't done a single thing wrong in this whole mess because I never had any intention of breaking up a marriage. Ava was the one who was planning a wedding with me while already being married to someone else, so I didn't understand how this was suddenly my fault. I just messaged him back saying that I had already kicked her out of my apartment and that he was welcome to her. My whole story about my dad's rules was obviously a lie, but once she was gone, I felt like I had finally washed off a layer of filth. Ava clearly thought this was just a temporary fight, and she had no idea that I was completely finished with her. She was probably with Ethan right then trying to convince him to give her a divorce, but it was clear that he wasn't going to make things easy. He kept sending me threats, telling me that he was quitting his job to come back to the States just to deal with me before hanging up. I realized that Ava hadn't told Ethan about her plan to scam me for the wedding money. If he knew about the money, he probably would have gone along with a fake divorce just to help her steal it before they got remarried. But Ethan was doing everything he could to stop me from marrying her because he had no idea there was money involved. All he knew was that his wife wanted a divorce to be with me, and he was completely in the dark about her plan to use me as a payday. It was clear that Ava and Ethan weren't as united as they seemed, since she had her own greedy agenda and he had his own pride. I knew that it was only a matter of time before their relationship fell apart, and I just had to wait for the right moment to watch them destroy each other. A few days later, Ava showed up at my office building in downtown Seattle with a warm lunch for me. I didn't reach for the food like I used to. I just looked at her and asked what she wanted. Ava bit her lip and gave me a shy smile, asking if she couldn't come visit her future husband since we were getting married soon. I took a few steps back to make sure there was plenty of space between us. "I'm busy, so don't come here unless it's actually important." She could tell I was being cold, but she still tried to push the issue by asking if she couldn't see her own boyfriend. I forced a smile and told her that we weren't even a couple anymore. Ava's face went pale, and she gripped the lunchbox tighter, asking me what the hell I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and showed her the messages I had exchanged with Ethan. Ava's face drained of color as she dropped the lunchbox onto the pavement and tried to grab my arm, babbling about how it was all a misunderstanding and that she only loved me. I shoved her hand off me and asked her exactly how Ethan had supposedly forced her to marry him. Ava immediately tried to play the victim, saying that Ethan had been stalking her and threatening to hurt me if she didn't marry him, and that she had only made a mistake because she was scared for my life. I couldn't help but laugh out loud at such a pathetic lie, telling her she must really love me then. Ava dropped to her knees and hugged my legs, crying about how sorry she was and that she was finalizing the divorce right now so we could be together. I was amazed by how quickly she had planned everything out, so I just kicked her off my leg and told her I wasn't interested in a woman who was already married. Ava sat on the ground, looking up at me with tears in her eyes, asking why I couldn't just understand her position. "I only married him to protect you because I don't even like him and I could never love a man like that." She started screaming insults at Ethan, acting like she absolutely hated his guts. But I could hear the lie in her voice because I knew Ethan was her first love and that he was the only person she actually cared about. I just sneered at her and told her to go clean up her own pathetic mess. Ava thought I was giving her a second chance and started nodding frantically, promising to fix everything. I quietly stopped the recording on my phone and went inside, immediately sending the audio file straight to Ethan. Ethan called me a few minutes later, and he was screaming so loud I could barely understand him, as the cold recording made her insults sound even more brutal. I knew their relationship was finished, and I just blocked his number so I wouldn't have to listen to him anymore. Since Ethan couldn't get a hold of me, I knew he would go straight to Ava, and things were going to get violent. 2 days later, I heard that Ethan had actually cracked her head open, and she called me from the hospital sobbing and asking me to come see her. I was so sick of her that I just hung up, especially since both she and Ethan had been harassing me from different numbers for days. I had already blocked at least 30 numbers when Ava's mother, Mrs. Miller, tried calling me. I decided to see what she wanted, and she told me in a fake, sad voice that Ava really regretted everything she had done. She and Ethan are completely over now, and as soon as the divorce is final, I will help you two get back together because she was actually a victim in all of this. That monster beat her again, and poor Ava is so terrified that he's going to come back for her. I didn't say a word and just let her keep talking to see what other lies she would tell. After a moment of silence, she actually told me that as a reward for staying with Ava, she would allow my name to be on the deed to the new house. I couldn't believe it because it meant their original plan was to buy the house with my money and only put in Ava's name. They were planning to steal my life savings to buy a house for themselves and then act like letting me live there was a favor. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever heard, and I just calmly asked her which hospital Ava was staying at. The old woman thought she had finally gotten through to me and told me that Ava was in room 208 at the hospital. I hung up on her and immediately unblocked Ethan on Instagram. I sent him her location and a message saying that I wasn't going to get involved with his wife anymore and that they deserved each other. Ethan replied instantly, telling me that Ava was as good as dead. I drove to the hospital and actually managed to get there before Ethan did. As I turned the corner of the hallway, I saw Mrs. Miller helping a bandaged Ava walk down the hall. I heard the old woman whispering to Ava that she better not tell Ethan about the money because it was only for the two of them. Ava adjusted the bandages on her head and promised her mother that Ethan had no idea about the money and that she would go back to him once she had my savings. They were even more disgusting than I imagined, as they were planning to scam everyone for money. To Ethan, his wife was just a cheater who was dumping him to go back to her ex, which explained why he had been so violent. I caught a glimpse of a man charging down the hallway toward them at full speed. It was Ethan, and he looked like he was about to murder someone, so I quickly ducked into a doorway and pulled up my face mask. He flew past me like a hurricane, and I could practically feel the heat of his rage as he went by. A second later, his voice boomed through the hallway as he screamed at Ava to stop running and face him like a woman. The two women nearly jumped out of their skins as they turned to see Ethan charging at them with a look of pure murder on his face. Ava's face went white as a sheet, and she shoved her mother aside as she scrambled toward her hospital room. Mrs. Miller tried to stop him, but Ethan just shoved her into the wall and told her to get out of his way. The old woman hit the wall so hard I could hear the bone crunch, and she collapsed onto the floor in a heap. She started screaming for someone to call the police because a madman was trying to kill her daughter. She couldn't even finish her sentence before she passed out from the pain and the stress. A team of nurses rushed over to help the old woman while I watched Ava and Ethan disappear into the room. Ethan slammed the door shut behind him, and the sound of the slam echoed in the hallway. A crowd of people started gathering around the door to see what the shouting was about, and I joined them to watch the show. People were whispering about how the door was locked and how terrifying the man looked, wondering what the woman could have possibly done. Someone suggested she must have cheated on him, and I leaned in and told them that the guy inside was actually the one she had been cheating with. I told them that he was just mad because his own wife was being taken by another man. I added that she was only divorcing him so she could scam another guy out of his life savings. The crowd was horrified, and everyone started muttering about how everyone in that room was just human garbage. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from inside the room, followed by a blood-curdling scream from Ava. Ava started screaming about her stomach and how much pain she was in. I peeked through the small window in the door and saw Ava curled up on the floor, clutching her stomach. She was frantically trying to unlock the door while screaming for someone to call a doctor because she was bleeding. The door finally flew open, and I saw that Ava's dress was completely soaked in blood. Everyone in the hallway backed away in horror, and I made sure to stay hidden behind the crowd so she wouldn't see me. Ava was ghost white and leaning against the door frame, screaming at the top of her lungs for a nurse. She didn't even stay upright for a minute before she collapsed onto the floor from the blood loss. The medical team arrived and threw her onto a stretcher, racing toward the emergency room to try and stop the bleeding. The minutes dragged on, but Ethan still hadn't walked out of that room. Everyone in the hall was convinced that Ethan had brutally beaten her into that state. People were too terrified to even go into the room, thinking that Ethan was a dangerous madman. A security guard finally went in with his baton drawn, only to start screaming for a doctor a few seconds later. He shouted that there was blood everywhere, and I finally felt a sense of peace wash over me. My plan to let these two monsters destroy each other had worked out even better than I had hoped. I pushed through the crowd into the room and saw Ethan lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood. There was a blood-stained 4-pole lying next to him, showing that Ava hadn't gone down without a fight. I just stood there in the background and watched the whole thing unfold like a movie. Ethan's head was gushing blood as they loaded him onto a stretcher, and it was a truly gruesome sight to behold. I decided to stay for a while and found a seat in the hallway to see how this whole tragedy would end. The first update I got was about Mrs. Miller, whose blood pressure had spiked to a dangerous level after the confrontation. The doctors had listed her in critical condition, and they were worried she was about to have a massive stroke. I watched the medical teams racing back and forth, trying their best to save her life. I had to admit that the Miller family was certainly keeping the hospital staff busy that afternoon. Ethan woke up about 30 minutes later with nothing more than a mild concussion. The very first thing he did when he opened his eyes was start screaming for Ava. He ignored the nurses and tried to climb out of bed, staggering down the hall while shouting that he was going to kill her. That lying bitch. I'm the one who usually cheats, and I can't believe she actually did this to me. He didn't even finish his sentence before his legs gave out and he face-planted right onto the hospital floor. I ignored his pathetic display and walked over to the surgical wing, where Ava had been in the operating room for over 2 hours. It was anyone's guess if the baby was going to survive the trauma. Suddenly, a nurse covered in blood ran out of the OR and started screaming for the next of kin because the patient was fading fast. I acted like a concerned bystander and told the nurse that her husband was just down the hall in room 208. The nurse ran off to find Ethan, but he absolutely refused to sign any of the consent forms for the surgery. He shouted at the nurse that they were getting a divorce and that he didn't care if she lived or died. After arguing with the hospital staff for 20 minutes, he finally scribbled his name on the paper just to get them to leave him alone. But by the time the paperwork was done and the surgeons could actually work, it was far too late for the baby. Ava looked like a corpse as they wheeled her out of the operating room. I overheard the nurses saying that the blunt force trauma to her abdomen had caused irreversible damage to her internal organs. Not only was the baby gone, but she had been forced to undergo an emergency hysterectomy. Ethan didn't even bother to look at her as they wheeled her past. He just went back to his room. Ava refused to stay in her bed and insisted on being wheeled to the waiting room to hear about her mother. I watched her disappear down the hall, knowing that all three of them had finally gotten exactly what they deserved. I walked out of the hospital and never looked back, later hearing that Mrs. Miller had survived the stroke. Unfortunately for her, the stroke had left her permanently paralyzed and confined to a hospital bed. Ava blamed every single thing that had happened to them on Ethan. One night, she managed to sneak into Ethan's room with a kitchen knife and stabbed him while he was sleeping. The whole thing was a disaster, and it happened right in the middle of their legal divorce proceedings. On the day the divorce was finalized, Ava showed up at my office building once again. She was wearing a diamond ring, and from a distance, she looked just like the woman I used to know. But looking at her now, all I felt was a wave of pure disgust, as any love I once had for her had been completely burned away. Being able to walk away without any lingering feelings was the best possible outcome for both of us. I didn't even bother going down to talk to her. I just called security and had her removed from the property. Every single one of Ava's carefully laid plans had blown up in her face, and now she had absolutely nothing left. I was never going to look back or forgive her for all the lies and betrayals she had put me through. Ava looked completely lost as she stood outside my office for hours, not leaving until the sun had gone down, and she finally realized I was never coming out. I eventually heard that Ethan had packed his bags and left Seattle to get as far away from Ava as possible. I suppose if they had both just been honest with each other, they wouldn't have ended up in such a miserable state. But they were both too obsessed with their own greed to ever be honest about anything. Ava ended up losing her job because of the police investigation, and now she was stuck at home taking care of her paralyzed mother with no help. As the months went by, what little money she had left slowly disappeared. 3 months later, I got a message from Ava begging me to take her back. I knew she still hated me and that she only wanted to get back together so she could steal the rest of my money. She had no idea that I'd already tracked down her burner account and gone through every single post with a fine-tooth comb. Just a few days ago, she had posted a desperate plea for advice on her secret Instagram account. The title of the thread was, "How do I trick my ex into coming back so I could take the rest of his money?" The comments were filled with like-minded gold diggers offering tips and step-by-step instructions on how to manipulate me. Ava had clearly studied the advice carefully, taking notes on every single suggestion. When she finally called me, I was already driving out of Seattle, heading back to my parents' house in Portland for a fresh start. I felt a small smile tug at my lips, but I kept my voice perfectly neutral as I told her I had already moved back home. Ava sounded more desperate and pathetic than I had ever heard her as she begged me not to leave and asked when I was coming back so we could talk. I told her that I was never coming back and that we were never going to see each other again as long as we lived. In the end, I simply walked away without any drama or any form of forgiveness. There's no shame in being a victim of a scam, But there is a deep shame in knowing you're being used and making excuses for the person doing it to you. Some people are nothing more than a bad debt, and it is far more important to write them off and move on than it is to waste your life trying to get back what you lost.